The stories we tell ourselves about history, they're just incredibly powerful, aren't they? They don't just reflect our past, they really actively shape our present. But what happens when those stories, well, when they're not quite the full picture? Today, we're taking a deep dive into a historical narrative that was meticulously crafted, almost like a piece of art, you could say, but one with really profound, lasting consequences. We're going to try and unravel the complex legacy of Emperor Hirohito of Japan, particularly how his image was presented and, perceived after World War II. Our sources, drawing from some pretty extensive academic research, they really challenge that popular perception of Hirohito as just this peaceful, sort of passive symbol.
Yeah, absolutely. And our mission today really is to unpack how Hirohito's post-war image as this innocent, peace-loving figure was actually a politically constructed narrative. We'll explore the evidence, and there's quite a bit of it, showing his strategic complicity in wartime aggression. And crucially, how this myth was sustained, often, at the cost of justice and historical truth. You're going to see firsthand how these powerful political myths get manufactured. It's not always just outright deception, but it's also about structural influences and sometimes the deliberate suppression of truth.
Okay, so let's dive right in. Let's start right after Japan's crushing defeat in World War II. You might have seen that famous image, right? Emperor Hirohito, maybe pictured bowing humbly or standing beside General Douglas MacArthur. That image and almost immediately became this powerful symbol of peace, continuity, a new Japan. But the story behind that, as you're saying, is a lot more complex.
It really is. This transformation wasn't organic. It wasn't something that just happened. It was a carefully orchestrated political operation. The central argument we're exploring is that Hirohito's innocence was, essentially, manufactured for a purpose. It wasn't earned or proven. You see, U.S. policymakers, especially General MacArthur, he was the supreme commander for the Allied powers, SAP, they saw the emperor's symbolic authority as absolutely crucial.
Crucial for what,
Well,
exactly?
for stabilizing a defeated Japan, primarily, for preventing widespread unrest, and perhaps, thinking strategically, curbing the rising threat of communist influence in the region. That was a big concern. As some scholars, like Anne Van Buren, argue, Hirohito was never prosecuted, not because there wasn't enough evidence there arguably was, but because his narrative usefulness, his value as a symbol, just outweighed the pursuit of justice.
Wow. So he was exonerated through convenience, essentially.
That's a stark way to put it, but yeah, convenience, not proof.
So how exactly did they do it? How did they manufacture this innocence?
It was done through a pre-systematic campaign, a lot of censorship, a lot of deliberate image making. Under SC, a strict control was imposed on all Japanese media. Herbert Bix notes this quite clearly. Occupation officials permitted basically no discussion in the press about Hirohito's role in the war, and definitely no calls for his abdication or trial. That was completely off the table.
So just silence the critics.
Silence them and replace the narrative. Newspapers, films, even textbooks were purged of anything that might, point a finger at him. They even restricted photos of Hirohito in his military uniform. Those were swapped out for images emphasizing his civilian clothes, often, like you said, standing next to MacArthur. It was a very deliberate visual erasure.
A conscious effort to change how he looked, literally.
Absolutely. And you know what? It was remarkably effective. Hirohito was pretty quickly recast, both in Japan and in the West, as this sort of benign, almost fatherly figure, someone constrained by the militarists. Despite, as we'll see, clear evidence of his active involvement. Hirohito describes his behavior sometimes as reflecting indirect approval, where maybe his hesitation or ambiguity actually allowed aggression to unfold.
It's quite chilling, isn't it? How a systematic campaign like that could literally rewrite a leader in the public eye. It wasn't just hiding facts, it was replacing them with a fiction that became the accepted truth. What did this re-engineering of history, what did it ultimately mean for Japan?
Well, on one hand, this preserved image definitely allowed Japan to retain a sense of continuous national identity. It arguably prevented social collapse right after the defeat. But, and this is a huge but, it came at a profound cost. A cost to truth and a cost to justice for millions of victims of war crimes, people affected by the Nanjing Massacre, the comfort women system. The list is long. As Van Buren states, the myth of the peace-loving emperor became a foundational narrative that legitimized historical amnesia. It wasn't just forgetting, it was almost like a societal agreement to selectively remember.
Okay, so to really get how this post-war myth was built, we need to understand what came before. Let's rewind a bit. Go back to the 1930s. Before Pearl Harbor, before the U.S. was even officially in the war, what was Hirohito's role then during Japan's imperial expansion? A lot of people still assume he was reluctant, just dragged along, but the sources suggest something different.
Very different, yes. This period reveals Hirohito not as some passive puppet, but as a decisive figure, although often discreet. He actively legitimized and enabled Japan's militarism. Take the Mukden incident in Manchuria, 1931. This was essentially a staged event by the Japanese Kwantung Army, right? A pretext to invade. What's striking is Hirohito's reaction. He didn't condemn it. Herbert Bix highlights this. Rather than punish the people responsible or force withdrawal, Hirohito basically sanctioned the occupation. He later endorsed the puppet state of Manchukuo, too.
So tacit approval right from the start.
Exactly. And this pattern kind of deepened with Japan's full-scale invasion of China in 1937. This huge escalation. It was approved by imperial ordinance with Hirohito's personal seal on it. Bix and others have documented how Hirohito got regular briefings. He issued commands on troop deployment, on tactics. He even authorized the use of chemical weapons against Chinese forces.
Okay, so definitely not just a figurehead, not a rubber stamp for the military.
Absolutely not. Now, the Meiji Constitution was tricky. It gave him supreme command, technically, but said ministers would advise. Hirohito, though, he exercised real agency through consultations, sometimes through strategic silence, and always through ratification. Hirohito calls his influence hesitant engagement. It wasn't usually direct confrontation, but more subtle reinforcement. His ambiguity often served as a, quote, lubricant for war.
A lubricant for war.
Yeah.
That's a powerful phrase. What about specific events, like the Marco Polo Bridge incident that kicked off the wider war with China?
Even there, the pattern holds. He received constant updates, he expressed worries, sure, but ultimately he approved the troop mobilization. He praised the commanders involved. It suggests that sometimes his misgivings might have been more performative than actual roadblocks to aggression.
Interesting. Now, some interpretations, like Noriko Kawamura's, suggest he was operating under duress, that he feared military coups, like the February 26th incident in 1936. That does complicate the picture, doesn't it?
It does, and it's a crucial point to consider. Kawamura argues he acted within real constraints, fearing destabilization, maybe even assassination. And the February 26th incident was serious. But here's the fascinating part. Look at how Hirohito reacted to that coup attempt. A radical army faction tried to take over. What did he do?
He acted decisively, didn't he?
Extremely decisively. He denounced the rebellion immediately. He insisted on its suppression forcefully, and he approved severe punishment for the ringleaders. So this shows that when the imperial stability, his stability, was threatened from within, he absolutely could and did act forcefully.
So what really stands out to you from this whole pre-war period then?
It's the contradiction, really. Decisive against internal threats, threats to his own power, but often quite pliant, or at least enabling, when aggression was directed outward. His intervention seemed calculated, more about risk and image management than about genuine pacifism. He was a kind of quiet catalyst for war, all while building this paradoxical image, sacred and distant, yet supreme, but somehow non-responsible. It's a masterclass in wielding power from behind a veil.
Okay, let's move into the war itself now. The full-blown Pacific War, including Pearl Harbor. The popular image, again, is often this detached emperor, but the documents, they tell a different story.
A very different story. Herbert Bix, again, drawing on records, reveals Hirohito wasn't just informed, he was informed in minute detail. He personally reviewed operational orders. He met regularly with top military commanders. And, disturbingly as we mentioned, he approved the use of chemical weapons multiple times.
And decisions like Pearl Harbor.
Those were finalized at imperial conferences. His ratification, his seal, was essential. It wasn't just symbolic. Bix states that in the weeks leading up to the attack, despite any private reservations he might have felt, Hirohito chose to give his consent at every stage.
And the war crimes aspect, his knowledge of those.
That's one of the most disturbing parts. His personal approval for poison gas use in China, like in Wuhan and Changsha, is documented. This wasn't just him signing off on something he didn't understand. Sources suggest he was an active moral participant.
But again, some argue he was deeply conflicted, maybe agonizing over these choices. Does the evidence really back that up?
Well, Kawamura does argue he was conflicted, maybe struggling with constitutional limits, deferring to the military out of fear. But that argument gets weaker when you look at his interventions at key moments, like ordering the Navy to re-engage at the Battle of Midway even when things looked bad, or taking a personal interest in specific operations in the South Pacific. Hirohito puts it quite sharply. She says he consistently played both sides of the political equation, distancing himself from failure while aligning himself with success.
So the conflict seemed maybe less about stopping the war and more about managing his own role and image within it.
That's certainly how Hada and Bix interpret it. His actions seem more strategic than purely conscientious.
Okay, so we've seen this deep involvement throughout. Then the war ends, Japan is defeated. How did Hirohito, this active moral participant, manage to reposition himself?
By August 1945, as defeat became inevitable, he'd already started positioning himself as the voice of reason, the one bringing peace. His surrender broadcast, the famous Jewel Voice broadcast, it framed the end of the war as a sad necessity, to save the nation. But crucially, there was no mention of the atrocities Japan committed, no mention of his own role in authorizing actions. This benevolent father figure forced into a tragic decision was precisely the narrative that the Allied occupation then picked up and cemented. His wartime conduct, in the end, showed this really elusive form of power, shaping outcomes through consent, through omission, through being that unifying symbol.
Right, so the U.S. occupation, led by MacArthur, deliberately chose to protect Hirohito. They saw him as essential for stability. But what was the cost? What was the fallout of that decision, especially for the victims?
The fallout was immense, and it still felt today. Yes, it was pragmatic politics maybe, but it was profoundly morally fraught. It directly led to the suppression of accountability for just unbelievable suffering. Think about the comfort women. This was a vast, military-run system of sexual slavery. Tens of thousands of women, mainly from Korea, China, the Philippines. Herbert Bick states it's just inconceivable that Hirohito, getting those detailed military briefings, didn't know about this institutionalized exploitation run by his own armed forces. Yet, he was never questioned about it, never held accountable.
And this extended beyond the comfort women issue.
Oh, absolutely. It extended to other horrific war crimes, the Nanjing Massacre, the human experimentation by Unit 731. The list goes on. Because there was no imperial acknowledgement, no apology from the top, it allowed Japan, in many ways, to frame its war experience primarily through victimhood, focusing on the atomic bombings, for instance, rather than fully reckoning with its role as the aggressor. As Hado observes, the failure to account for Hirohito's role let a narrative flourish where Japan's suffering was foregrounded and its aggression was minimized. It's chilling. The silence of one person, amplified by political convenience, having such far-reaching consequences. How does this historical amnesia, as you call it, continue to impact things today? International relations? Japan itself?
The cost is still very real. Victims and their families are still seeking recognition, apologies, reparations. Look at South Korea. They repeatedly demand Japan take full responsibility for the comfort women system. And Hirohito's name, his role, is conspicuously absent from official Japanese narratives about it. This absence constantly strains diplomatic ties. And unfortunately, it also emboldens revisionist voices within Japan who want to deny or downplay these atrocities altogether.
And internally, within Japan.
Internally, some argue the lack of imperial accountability weakened the ethical foundations of Japan's post-war democracy. Hirohito's silence wasn't noble, Bix argues. It was calculated. He chose preserving the imperial institution, ensuring its continuity, over confronting the truth and pursuing justice. A profound trade-off. You've mentioned his personal actions as choices. But you also talk about the system itself, this structure of cowardice. Can you unpack that a bit more? How did the very architecture of power allow him to operate like this?
Right, it's not just about him as an individual. The structure of cowardice refers to how the system itself enabled this evasion. The Meiji Constitution gave him supreme command, yes, but it also wrapped his role in layers of ritual and ambiguity. So Hirohito learned, or perhaps was trained, to act in ways that shaped outcomes without taking direct, formal responsibility. He could stay at the center of decisions, but let others be the public face. He mastered this weird space between being sovereign and being invisible.
How did the bureaucracy play into that?
The bureaucracy was key. It was deeply hierarchical, deeply reverential towards the emperor. So you had ministers claiming they acted under imperial will. Then you had the emperor, or the palace, claiming he acted under ministerial advice. Military officials would cite imperial sanction for their actions, but the palace could then point to military pressure as the reason for the sanction. Anne Van Buren calls it a hall of mirrors. Every reflection of power pointed to someone else. Responsibility just diffused.
So the system itself was almost designed for evasion.
It certainly enabled it, maybe not designed for it, but it absolutely enabled it. And while, as Kawamura suggests, fear of coups might have been a genuine constraint sometimes, his selective engagement tells another story. When things went well, he issued commendations, took credit indirectly. When they failed, He allowed military leaders to take the fall, retreating into that ceremonial silence. It was a very calculated approach to power.
And the post-war occupation just reinforced this.
It did. SK8 and the Japanese imperial aides worked together, really, to construct that narrative. Hirohito was misled, he was powerless, he was a pacifist, trapped by militarists. As Arihara notes, the Americans did not invent the myth of the detached emperor, they simply adopted and amplified it for their own strategic reasons.
It's really quite something. How power could be wielded so effectively, yet accountability so thoroughly deflected. Governing from behind a veil, as you said.
It's a chilling case study, isn't it? His evasion wasn't just accidental, it was engineered both by him and by the structures around him, including the post-war structure imposed by the Allies. His reign really shows how a leader can be visible, symbolic, yet remain untouchable when it comes to blame. And it's a potent reminder of how institutions can be used not just to check power, but sometimes to actively obscure it.
Which brings us to memory itself. This isn't just about history books. It's about how societies remember, how they teach the past. The story of Hirohito has clearly been a battleground for historians. What has that struggle actually looked like?
Oh, it's been intense right from the beginning. Immediately post-war, scholars were grappling with these contradictions. Early interpretations, heavily influenced by the political needs of the occupation, mostly presented him as passive, like you said, a symbol. Noriko Kawamura describes how he was initially seen, a moral center who endured the tragedy of war with stoic grace, not as a participant, but as a witness. That narrative served a purpose then.
So when did that start to really shift? What caused the challenge?
A major turning point, arguably the biggest, was Herbert Bix's book, Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan, published in 2000. It won the Pulitzer Prize. Bix used a ton of primary sources, many newly available, and his argument was forceful. The emperor was no puppet. He was a full partner in the planning and execution of war, and his decisions had real consequences for millions. That book really ignited a wave of revisionist scholarship. People couldn't ignore it.
So Bix presented him as a full partner. Were there other perspectives emerging too?
Yes, absolutely. Scholars like Arihara offered maybe more nuanced views. She framed his indecision, his ambiguity, not as weakness, but as a form of agency. She argued his silence was not merely passive, it was political. And then you have Anne Van Buren, who focused more on how the U.S. occupation co-produced his image. She emphasized the geopolitical reasons, calling his survival and rehabilitation a collaborative effort between the U.S. and Japanese elites.
Okay, so this academic debate is happening. How does that filter down? What does it mean for how history is actually taught today, especially in Japanese classrooms?
That's where it gets really contentious. This struggle plays out constantly in debates over Japanese history textbooks. Analyses like Kazuo Fukuoka's work show how conservative groups often push hard for narratives that emphasize national pride, downplay atrocities, and crucially, minimize or completely omit Hirohito's decision-making role. They might use vague language like the government decided instead of mentioning the emperor's involvement. Fukuoka notes the emperor is often presented in sanitized terms, if at all, to avoid controversy and preserve national cohesion.
So educational ambiguity is the term used.
Exactly. And this ambiguity has real consequences. It affects how younger generations understand Japan's role in the 20th century and how they engage with neighboring countries like China and Korea, who are still seeking full acknowledgement. While there are definitely progressive educators fighting for more critical perspectives, for a fuller accounting, they often face political pressure. And the Ministry of Education sometimes restricts the adoption of more critical textbooks. There's an institutional bias that tends to reinforce this kind of soft forgetting.
We've certainly taken a deep dive today into Hirohito's story. It really reveals how that post-war image wasn't just history unfolding. It was meticulously engineered, a political myth. It's such a powerful example of how historical narratives get constructed, how they get maintained, and how deeply they shape a nation's memory.
And the cost of that myth, as we've discussed, has been immense. Not just for the victims of Japan's wartime violence who were denied justice and acknowledgement for so long, but also, arguably, for the moral integrity of post-war Japan itself. The very figure who presided over a catastrophic war was repositioned as the key to national healing, allowing difficult truths to be just, selectively erased.
Yeah, and connecting this to the bigger picture, Hirohito's story really feels like a cautionary tale, doesn't it, for all of us? It shows how leaders can govern from behind that veil, how systems can obscure responsibility, and how powerful public myths can sometimes overpower even clear empirical truth.
Absolutely. The lesson isn't just historical, it's political, it's moral. It really demands that you, listening now, interrogate the narratives you encounter, question the convenient stories, and always consider the silences, what's not being said in your own understanding of history.
So here's something for you to mull over. If silence can be such an incredibly powerful tool in shaping history and avoiding accountability, what unspoken truths might be shaping the narratives all around us today? And what is the real, often hidden, price of that silence?